Hello and welcome to Game 4 in this 2024 World Chess Championship. And today Ding Liren has the white pieces against the young challenger Gukesh. And the battle continues. So this is the fourth game of 14 unless they tie and go on to tiebreakers. So it looks like the world champion begins with knight to f3, the ready opening. Which controls these central squares and is kind of a flexible opening, waiting to see what the challenger does. And so the game continues with d5 here, grabbing space in the center, and the world champion continues with e3. So after this move, we have knight to f6, and something a little different here. b3 being played instead of d4, which could maybe transpose into a queen's gambit or something along those lines. So the game continues with bishop to f5, developing this bishop outside of the pawn chain, so now you can push this pawn forward, not block in the bishop. So the game continues with bishop to e2, developing kind of a defensive move here. The bishop has already moved, so you don't have to worry about a pin on that knight unless the bishop moves again. But developing here and allowing the king to castle to safety. So now we have h6 being played, keeping pieces out of this g5 square, and perhaps maybe with an intention of pushing this pawn forward and starting an attack on the king side. So let's see how the game continues. Interesting move here. Bishop to a3, the best move. Now normally you would place the bishop here when you fianchetto, push this b pawn, but this is a good move because now if this pawn pushes forward to get ready to develop the bishop here, there can be an exchange preventing Gukesh from castling here. So the bishop could capture, the king would probably recapture, or the rook, but that would stop castling. So what does Gukesh do here? He plays the best move, developing his other knight, and we have castling by white. So the game continues with e6 here. So will there be an exchange of dark squared bishops? Yes, the bishops are exchanged, and now the knight recaptures. So, capturing with the knight, the best move in the position. Now you're still able to castle, although this knight will have to move out of the way, of course. And the game continues with c4. This is often a good strategy where if a central pawn, a d pawn, whenever the queen pawns are pushed forward, you can attack the more valuable central pawn with this less valuable flank pawn. So the game continues with knight getting out of the way of king and rook so that black may castle on the king side here. And the game continues with the knight developing and putting more pressure on this pawn here. So there's a battle being waged around the d5 pawn. So how will the game continue here? Well, we have castling by the challenger and a exchange of pawns here in the center. So will we have a recapture with pawn or knight? Capturing with the pawn would gain some space in the center. So let's see what happens. Yes, the pawn captures, and now if this pawn pushes forward, space will be even in the center. So the game continues with b4, and the computer states that this is the best move in the position. What does this do? Well, it grabs some more space on the queen side, preventing this pawn from pushing forward and gaining space on the A file. It also prevents the knight from pushing forward here. And it may also discourage this pawn from pushing forward, because then after an exchange, black would be left with an isolated queen pawn, which can be an endgame weakness, especially as pieces are traded off. So the game continues with c6, fortifying this central pawn, and now we have knight to d4, targeting the bishop here, which is unprotected at the moment. So after a retreat by the bishop, the queen develops off the back rank and the rooks are connected so that they can work better in tandem, protecting one another. And now there's more room here for the rooks to maneuver and position themselves in behind pawns that they plan to push forward or exchange, or place the rook, possibly here on the half open file. So the game continues with knight launching forward here towards the enemy, and now space is gained with this a4 pawn push here. Perhaps we will have a type of minority attack where two pawns go up against three here on the queen side. So the game continues with rook onto the c file. That way, if this pawn pushes forward and there's an exchange, the rook will be well positioned here for maybe a battle on the open c file. So the game continues with a5 by the world champion. And now we have this b pawn pushing forward, adding pressure here. The queen is backing this up, but of course the b pawn and rook are covering that. So the game continues with a knight retreat here, attacking the unprotected knight. So after capture and recapture, the bishop is repositioned here, where it aims more at the center, but for the moment the pawns are blunting the scope of this bishop. So the game continues with d4, and the computer states that this is the best move in the position. Pushing forward, maybe trying to open up this d file, and also the pawn is being captured here, the knight is being captured. So the knight will probably move, otherwise, if this pawn captures, well then white will be left with an isolated queen pawn, which could be a weakness in the endgame. So we have knight retreat. Now the knight counterattacks the pawn, and then after exchanges in the center, we're left with a pawn majority of 4 versus 1, 4 versus 3 on the king side here, and on the queen side a pawn majority for black with 3 versus 2. So in these positions, you want to push the unopposed pawn here. Eventually maybe these two pawns will exchange off, then you push the other unopposed pawn, and possibly the same here with black. Maybe you push this pawn. If there's a capture, these pawns could exchange here, and then black would be left with this passed pawn. So that is where the game is heading, maybe a battle of passed pawns in the end. So let's see what happens. Bishop centralizes, attacking white's bishop, threatening to capture and double rooks here and leave this h-pawn isolated and kind of wreck white's pawns. So we have this being ignored with an attack on the queen. So a lot of times if you can ignore your opponent's attack in favor of a more powerful counterattack, you can dictate the flow of the game a little bit better. So black is forced to stop here and deal with this attack on the queen. So we have the queen moving, protecting the bishop here, and now an exchange of bishops. The knight moves forward, blockading this pawn, which I mentioned. if you have a pawn majority, you want to push the unopposed pawn that doesn't have an enemy pawn in front of it. But now the knight is blocking, although we could have this pawn push forward, harassing the knight, chasing it back. So let's see what happens. Instead, we have an exchange here, capture, and knight repositions, moving up towards the center, attacking the enemy knight. And it's looking like more exchanges are about to happen here. The rooks are fighting for this open file, so possible exchange of rooks here. Knights possibly could be exchanged. Let's see what happens. So there we go. The knights are traded off. The queen is centralized here, so always a good strategy in the endgame when the queens are still on the board. If you can centralize your queen, it is more powerful there. It just has more mobility. It covers a lot more squares. So now the queen is eyeing this pawn. It is blockading this pawn. So the game continues with h3 here. So this move is an excellent move. It allows a little escape hatch for the king, possibly. Or, if the king wants to head towards the center, well, then this pawn cannot be targeted as it is protected by its own pawn. So we have a pawn pushing forward on the queen side, so perhaps more exchanges of pawns here. And after a rook exchange, now we have pawns being exchanged, and black is left with a passed pawn on the queen side here. So how will the game continue? Well, the rook lines up on this pawn, preventing it from moving forward. Also the threat of pushing forward here with the rook, maybe attacking the queen, or the queen trying to exchange off the queen. So let's see what happens. Queen drops back, maybe anticipating a possible attack by the rook. Queen is also keeping an eye on this unprotected pawn, which the rook was attacking, of course. So now we have a battery of queen and rook here. So the game continues with rook pressing forward, helping to protect the pawn here. Well, let's see how this continues. So the G pawn is pushed forward, blocking the possibility of the queen landing here at some point, if the king tries to move to the side, but also possibly giving the option of allowing the king to press forward. So the game continues with black grabbing space on the king side here, and now we have queen jumping forward, and the king comes forward. So a good strategy in the endgame, especially with so few pieces on the board, is to activate your kings. But you have to be careful. When queens are still on the board, this could be a problem. We have already the queen lined up on the king. So let's see how the game continues here. Perhaps you could push forward and try and attack this pawn, which is pinned to your king, to black's king here. So queen centralizes. And now we have the rook, black's queen dropping back, creating a battery here, maybe threatening to attack the rook, place the rook possibly on the 7th rank, which can be a good strategy. But for the moment, the rook and the queen for black are stuck on guard duty, protecting this pawn on c5 because the rook-queen battery are attacking. All right, so the computer states that the game is pretty much even here. So let's see what happens. Pawn pushes forward, and now instead of exchanging pawns, we have the rook adding more pressure here. So after capture, we have an unopposed pawn that pushed forward. As I mentioned, that's a good strategy, and traded off. So now, a lot of times you want the next unopposed pawn to push forward. But white will have to watch out because this pawn is also doing a good job of helping guard the king, so that the queen doesn't drop down here and harass the king on the 7th rank. So the game continues with a centralizing queen move, and this is also important as well. A lot of times, if your king is here and there is a diagonal through the center of the board, it can be a good strategy to place your queen along this diagonal to block checks on your king, especially when queens are on the board, because if you're not careful, there could be a nasty surprise, a fork on your king and some other pawn or piece if there were more pieces on the board. So white places the queen on this diagonal, helping guard the king. And now we have a trade, though, because possible trade. The queen is pinned here, and it's looking like the queens will be traded. And sure enough, the queens are off the board now. Black has the advantage of this passed pawn, but it is isolated. So the game continues with the king attempting to move forward and try and centralize, maybe help attack this pawn. But the rook is doing a good job of cutting off the king, kind of trapping the king over here on the king side. So the young challenger, Gukesh, launches his king forward. White moves his king up. And where should this rook go? Well, let's take a look here. The rook pushes forward, checking the king. And once again, the king is boxed in, now a smaller box, and he'll have to retreat here. So king retreats back, but this pawn is under attack. So rook just protects the pawn, and we have another attack. So it's starting to look like we'll have a repetition of position here, just moving back and forth. And yes, now it does look that way. And a draw after the position is repeated on the board 3 times. After 42 moves here in round 4 of the World Chess Championship, it looks like they have drawn, and we'll have to go on to game 5 tomorrow and see what happens, how this great tournament continues. And also, I want to take a look with the game review here and see what accuracy rating these players played at. So let me pull that up. All right, quite impressive here, both players with 98.9% accuracy rating. So outstanding by these world-class players. No brilliant or great moves, but out of 42 moves, Ding Liren had 21 of the best moves according to the computer here, and 23 best moves for Gukesh. And then if we look at inaccuracies, any bad moves, only 1 inaccuracy by Ding Liren, but no mistakes, no misses or blunders. And almost a perfect game by Gukesh here. No inaccuracies, no mistakes, misses, or blunders. And I'll move my image here, and you can see what equivalent rating these outstanding players played at here. So the computer calculates that they played with the equivalent of 2950 for the world champion, and a 3,000 rating equivalent in this game for the young challenger. So, outstanding by both players, although it was a draw. So, I hope you, as well as I, am looking forward to some great games here over the next few days, the next week or more, depending how these how the rest of the games go. All right, feel free to leave any comments as always. Let me know what you think. Also, like and subscribe if you haven't already to support the channel. Thank you for watching and have a super chess day.